Hello and welcome to Coast AM. This is Lisa Garrer, and it is such a pleasure to be with you this evening. First, we are going to be talking about fake food. Fish is one of the most frequently faked foods Americans can buy. 99% of Kobe beef sold in the U.S. is fake. 100% Parmesan cheese that is sold in the bottles there is actually cut with everything from cheaper cheeses to wood pulp. We're going to find out how our government is complicit in the fake food racket with Larry Olmsted when we come back. He is an extreme U.S. journalist. He was voted one of the top most extreme U.S. journalists. Larry is, and we'll be speaking with him when we come back. This is Lisa Garrer. You're listening to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm Lisa Garrer. So you've seen the headlines possibly where it says Parmesan cheese is made from sawdust, or lobster rolls don't contain lobster at all. Or maybe you've heard about extra virgin olive oil that isn't olive oil. So these are the fake foods that are in our supermarkets, they're in our restaurants, they're in our kitchen, and we don't necessarily know about this because it is an unregulated industry. For the most part, a lot of the labeling, common food labeling, is a complete scam. Some of our own government agencies have either lost their funding to continue to do research on this or continue to do investigations on this, and it's up to us to learn a lot more. So someone has done this for us. Larry Olmsted, he was named one of the 10 top most extreme U.S. journalists by the Society of Professional Journalists. His expose on counterfeit Kobe beef for Forbes.com was widely covered by newspapers and websites and radio shows. And he has written a new book called Real Food, Fake Food: Why You Don't Know What You're Eating and What You Can Do About It. Welcome to the show, Larry.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So tell me what your interest was, first of all, in writing a book like this.
I've been writing as a journalist on travel and food topics for over 20 years, for newspapers and magazines all around the world. I've traveled a great deal and gotten to eat a lot of interesting things. And when I travel, I always make it a point to try to eat, whatever the specialty is in the places I go, what the people eat, what the place is known for. And, when you do that, you occasionally have something really good, really memorable. And I would come back from these trips and then try to replicate it or order the same thing here in the U.S. And a lot of the times I was very disappointed. I would, have something like Kobe beef in Japan and then come back and try to order it here. It never looked or tasted right, and I wondered about that. So when I started to research it, I realized that the reason it didn't look or taste right was because it wasn't the real thing, and that this problem was much more pervasive than I would have thought. So that sort of set me down the road on writing this book.
So how did you discover 99.9% of Kobe beef in the U.S. that's sold in the U.S. is fake?
Well, at the time that I started, it was 100%.
Oh, really?
Because, so I went to Japan and I had Kobe beef, and not only does it taste very different, but it looks very different, even before it's cooked. And sort of look at a steak and tell whether it's Japanese beef or not. So when I came back here, I would go to, nice steakhouses around the country or even local restaurants. There was sort of this epidemic of Kobe burgers and Kobe sliders. Like I said, I was always disappointed. So when I looked into it, I found fairly quickly that the importation of Japanese beef was banned by the USDA unconditionally in every form, frozen, fresh, whole, ground, no Japanese beef whatsoever arriving in the United States. And this was just over 4 years ago. Every restaurant in the country claiming to serve Kobe beef was basically lying to its customers. That has changed. Now the importation of Kobe beef is legal, but there are currently 10 restaurants in the entire United States serving the real thing. And
only 10.
Only 10, exactly 10.
So that food truck rolling down the street that says Kobe beef burgers is not really the real thing. Well, first of all, why did they ban it in the U.S. in the first place?
It's actually, Japanese beef has been banned and then unbanned and banned again and unbanned, and in recent history been because of outbreaks of hoof and mouth disease. It's not uncommon, and it's not just Japan. The USDA and the FDA routinely ban temporarily the imports of products from different parts of the world due to safety concerns. But in that case, the importation of Japanese beef was banned for the majority of the 21st century.
Wine from other countries, yes. Food, I don't know. Beef, I don't know. So what is Wagyu beef?
So Wagyu is the sort of catch-all term for the indigenous breeds of Japanese cattle. And there's 5 different breeds that fall under the name Wagyu, but they're all pretty similar. For our purposes, you can think of Wagyu like Scotch whiskey. There's differences within it, but it's one category of a particular product. Kobe beef is just a regional form of Wagyu. It's a Wagyu that's raised under certain rules in the area around Kobe City. Like a lot of foreign specialty foods and American specialty foods like Kona coffee, it's named for the place it comes from. And Wagyu, there's a lot of other famous and highly respected Japanese beef that just hasn't gotten the cachet of Kobe in this country, and all of those would be Wagyu. So Wagyu is even more mysterious to the American consumer. There are Wagyu-bred cattle or breed cattle being raised here in the United States that are very similar to those in Japan, and there's Wagyu breed cattle being raised here in the States that are very dissimilar to those in Japan. And then there's a lot of product in restaurants called Wagyu that has nothing whatsoever to do with Japanese breed. It's kind of a crapshoot. It can be very real, very fake.
So why is this not a regulated industry where menus and labeling, such as organic and so forth, is not more controlled?
Well, there's a variety of problems. So at the top, there's foods that are just counterfeit. So they are regulated, but it doesn't really matter, which would, say, like buying a counterfeit Rolex or Gucci bag in the street. Clearly illegal, but it's not really well enforced, which is why Chinatown in New York City can stand on the street with a table and sell those things. Everybody knows it's illegal, but it's not a high priority for law enforcement. Then there's, the USDA and the FDA both have, some sort of serious lapses in their labeling standards. They might have a definition of something, but it's so broad as to be meaningless, or they often choose not to define things. The perfect example would be natural. The FDA has intentionally and repeatedly chosen not to define the term natural. So by not defining it, there's no legal standard, which means you can't really break a law or violate anything by calling something natural. So many of the foods we buy today in the supermarket
it's on everything, yes,
are labeled natural, which is meaningless. And then beyond that, there's the restaurant issue, which is this is the one that surprised a lot of readers of my book. I mean, it surprised me when I researched it. The restaurants, are not subject to the same labeling rules as retailers. Those FDA and USDA laws that apply to your box of cereal do not apply to the restaurant menu. So it's sort of the Wild West when you go into a restaurant. They make claims on the menu all the time that are just, outright lies, and nobody holds them accountable.
So you've done a lot of this research for us. Let's talk about fish. And you say that sushi is one of the world's worst real food choices that you could make in America. Why is that?
I think, seafood is probably the most fraud-ridden category, and then within the restaurant industry of all the different sort of specialty niches, sushi would be the one that I've seen the most fraud in. And with all of the fake food, there's sort of a recurring theme. When you can't, look at a product and easily tell what it is, you're more subject to fraud. And, so I'm sure you remember a couple of years ago there was a lot of publicity, or there was this big horse meat scandal in Europe. The British and other Europeans found out that a lot of their frozen food, like beef lasagna, was actually horse meat, and that didn't affect us in our country. But the reason it worked is because when you buy like a frozen lasagna, you can't look at it and tell what kind of meat is in it. It could be horse, it could be beef. You can't really tell, and that's how it is with a lot of sushi, especially in our country. People eat a lot of rolls. The piece of fish that you're looking at is the diameter of a pencil eraser, and it's wrapped in rice that's heavily flavored with vinegar and seaweed, so you can't really see that so-called tuna. You can't hardly taste that so-called tuna, whereas if you had like a tuna steak, you'd actually see some of the fish. So, sushi really lends itself to that because the fish is so disguised already when you're served. And in white fish in particular, which is why seafood is such a big problem, most people cannot tell one white fish from another once it's been cut up. Red snapper, which is very expensive, but also the single most substituted fish in this country and in sushi restaurants as well, looks just like tilapia, which is much, much cheaper. Anytime you have two things that look the same and you can sell it for a high price but substitute a cheap version, there's going to be fraud.
What about the differences between tilapia and red snapper and some of these other white fishes? Are there any that are highly toxic that we should definitely not be eating?
Well, Probably the worst that's sort of readily available would be escalar. Its nickname in the seafood industry is the X-lax of the sea.
Oh.
Without getting too graphic, it's prone to giving people digestive distress. That's because of a naturally occurring wax in this fish. It's a fish that's been frequently substituted for tuna in sushi restaurants in particular. And, the irony here is, we got our love of sushi from Japan. Japan has some of the best food safety standards in the world, and in Japan, this particular fish, escalar, has been banned for 40 years because it's not good for you. In our country, it's legal. It's true of a lot of the fish that are substituted. You're never going to hear of your friends going down to the fish market and saying, hey, give me a pound of escalar.
Right.
These fish are imported really specifically to be substituted for other fish and rip people off.
I see. So that the white fish is not a good idea. Of course, not doing rolls is a good idea. Okay, we've learned that. But what about salmon? So can salmon really be wild caught? And is it usually wild caught from Alaska? Is it better finding in streams, or is it really all farmed, or most of it?
Well, a lot of about 40% of the seafood that we consume today worldwide is farmed. Aquaculture is big. It's here to stay. Part of the future of, trying to feed a world that's going to be 10, 12, 15 billion people. Aquaculture across the board is not bad, just like raising cattle is not bad, but it can be done very badly and has been done very badly for the most part. It's improving, and I've certainly seen fish farms and salmon farms that do a really good job, but I don't think most of them do. A lot of the salmon we get is farmed, and probably the biggest misconception for consumers when they see Atlantic salmon. You can go into a lot of supermarkets in this country, and you'll see a sign that says fresh Atlantic salmon. And that's literally true. It's fresh and it's Atlantic salmon, but what most people don't know is that all Atlantic salmon is farmed. Atlantic salmon is commercially extinct in the wild. So when you see the words Atlantic salmon, that's synonymous with farm, but it might not say that because people don't want to pay top dollar for farm salmon, so they don't advertise it. Almost all of the wild-caught salmon that we consume in the United States comes from Alaska, and it's delicious. I only buy wild-caught salmon. Not only do I think it tastes better, but it's wild-caught, which means it's not raised on antibiotics and with vaccines and products that are used in fish farming. It eats a natural diet, which the fish eats, which does not do in a fish farm. Also, the waters in Alaska are, unusually clean. They're very closely monitored. The fish is fantastic. The problem is it's more expensive. It's seasonal. It's often defrauded because, again, I said when something looks the same, you can get a cheaper version, there's going to be fraud. So in supermarket studies, about 20% of the time people have bought what's advertised as wild-caught salmon for a higher price. It's actually farm salmon. And in restaurants, it's more like a third of the time or more, and as high as two-thirds, depending where they do the studies.
How would you know, though? I mean, is it pinker in color? And when it says color added, does that mean that it's most likely the farmed salmon?
No, I guess the wild is actually sort of redder.
Oh, yeah.
It's darker. It's really hard to tell just looking at one. It's easier when they're side by side. So when you go to the supermarket, and a lot of times they'll have what says wild-caught salmon for one price, say, $23 a pound, and next to it, farm salmon that's cheaper, $16 a pound. They should not look exactly the same. If they look exactly the same, that's a bad sign. Farm salmon tends to be very regular in shape and size because the fish are more consistent. All the steaks, say, in a row in the supermarket will look pretty similar. There's more variation in the wild caught. It is one of the fish that experienced seafood buyers and industry people can tell apart by looking. Chefs. It's hard for the average person, whereas even people in the seafood industry have a lot of trouble telling apart the white fish. The good news about salmon is, for the most part, it looks different from all the other fish. So when you buy salmon, at least you're usually getting salmon. You're not going to get tilapia or escalar or swai or one of the common counterfeits. There have been, the one fish that does look like salmon is steelhead trout from Chile, and there have been cases of that being passed off in restaurants. There was a case in Florida of a distributor being fined millions of dollars for importing Chilean steelhead trout and relabeling it salmon. So, the fake food industry is a $50 billion a year industry, and it's very similar to the narcotics business in that there's small scale players and there's large organized players. Organized crime is involved.
Wow.
The main difference is it's really hard to go to jail for smuggling or
shrimp,
adulterated
right?
Food.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
It's better business to be in than heroin.
I mean, the drugs that are in these fish, the shrimp specifically, I was reading your book and it was talking about the shrimp that had unapproved drugs, that you mentioned the vaccines, the hormones, the chemicals that are in these farmed shrimp, and that the FDA basically has this as a very low priority and devotes minimal resources to discovering any type of regulation on this or monitoring the shipments. It's all very, as you said, it's all very sketchy. But isn't the FDA responsible for making our food safe? Isn't that the whole point of it?
They are, and especially when it comes to seafood. Unlike most of the other categories, certainly of protein that we eat, beef, pork, chicken, almost all of our seafood is imported. Over 90% of the seafood we consume in the United States is imported. For very little of our beef is imported, and when we do import beef, it's something like Kobe beef that's, a specialty that we think is even better. The seafood that we import is not better, for the most part, than our domestic seafood. The irony here is, we have great fisheries in the United States, Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico. Some of our fish command top dollar in the international market. So what happens is we export it to countries like Japan that are willing to pay top dollar for, say, Alaskan fish, and then import really cheap farm fish from Southeast Asia. And shrimp in particular, which you mentioned, has a really bad track record of being farmed under suspect and criminal circumstances. And then, for example, the FDA banned the import of shrimp from from China because of these banned drugs. So the Chinese producers just send it to a third-party country like India or Malaysia and relabel it as a product of there to get around the rules. It's called transshipping, and it happens a lot with food. The FDA has just recently started to really step up their investigation of imported seafood, and this is because in 2014...
Wait one sec. We're actually going to need to learn about this because I also want to find out what's going on with the fast food industry and what exactly that fish is. When we come back, my guest is Larry Olmsted. The book is called Real Food, Fake Food. We will be right back. This is Lisa Garrer. You're listening to Coast AM. Hello, this is Lisa Garrer, and my guest tonight, Larry Olmsted. We're talking about fake food, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about why the governments do not regulate this industry more, why terms like organic and natural and free range and even extra virgin don't actually mean anything because they're not enforced, and how this could apply to everything that we're eating. It's not just the Kobe beef, the fish, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the Parmesan cheese and the olive oil. It is everything else that you eat. It's coffee. It's the flavorings in coffee, like the pumpkin spice racket. There's a huge industry on some of these spices. Champagne, honey, all sorts of things. But then we're going to find out what the independent state governments are doing to bypass the feds to actually make food safer, what third label parties you can trust better than government standards. So we will be back with all that information with Larry Olmsted when we come back. This is Lisa Garrer. You're listening to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. I am Lisa Garrer, and my guest is Larry Olmsted. We're talking about Real Food, Fake Food, and that's the name of his book. So can we talk a little, you mentioned the fish industry before we were going to the break. When you go to a fast food restaurant and they see fish on the menu, I was actually, my daughter was looking at an Instagram thing earlier today, and she was journaling the oil in a fast food restaurant, saying the first day that the batch of oil is used, it's usually like a yellow color. And then they said you can't add the chicken until the third day, and then you can't add the fish until the second week. And by the time that batch of oil is done, it could be used to basically go into your car. It's thick black oil. And this is what food is cooked in that's coming through our fast food chains. It's not only the food, but it's the process in which they fry these foods in the same oil for weeks. Do you know anything about this?
It's tough to paint the whole fast food industry with a broad brush. Obviously fast food gets a bad name, but it's a big industry with a lot of different players. I write this column for USA Today called Great American Bites, which focuses on some of the country's best sort of road food, hole-in-the-wall, restaurants, the kind of places you'd stop if you were road tripping across the country. And I've been to a number of these sort of, famous seafood shacks, clam shacks on the coast of New England, places like that, and the South on the Atlantic coast. And the ones that stand out as being excellent and being acclaimed, one of the things they all have in common is they always talk about how often they change their oil. Sometimes, I've been at seafood shacks that change the oil 4 times a day in the fryers. That's a lot for the industry.
Mm-hmm.
But, I don't know what the standards are for McDonald's or Burger King or the big chains, and I'm sure they do have standards because they have standards for everything in terms of how often they change that oil.
So, but it's not regulated again, though, other than the independent chain.
No, I assume that the cleanliness type issues for restaurants are regulated at the state level, and that can be very, very different. I went to a chef's boot camp recently, an industry event, where chefs from around the country were talking about how different the local inspection laws are. So most states have a rule on basically once you open a package of something, how quickly you have to use it up. Varied tremendously from like 3 days to 2 weeks, depending on the state.
What about the restaurant ratings, like the A, B, C? Is that a regulated? Do you have any information on that in terms of if it's bought and paid for or if it's legit?
Well, it is regulated, but again, it's at the local level, not even the state level, the municipality. So, New York City is pretty famous because they instituted this a few years ago, and there's those big letters in the window.
Mm-hmm.
They have a C. What happens once you fail?
Yeah, I know. You don't put up a C.
That's different in New York City than it is in other parts of New York State, let alone the rest of the country. It's very variable around the country. And, to give people an idea, the one issue that's been talked about lately is the expiration date on milk. You go to buy a quart of milk, it has a date on it, used by date. There's no kind of scientific standard or anything for when milk is no longer good. Every state sort of takes a guess at it, and of the 50 states, we have 41 different standards for how to label that milk. And in some states, milk is thrown out when it's perfectly good. In other states, it might be on the shelf for too long. There's a lot of sort of just things that have always been done a certain way that are guesswork and have no science behind them.
How come it's not federally regulated? It's state regulated.
It just depends on whether it's an issue of interstate commerce. I live in Vermont, the milk produced in Vermont or in a nearby state, so it doesn't have to cross a state border. But I think a lot comes down to the issue of big government versus local government. A lot of consumers want more regulation at the local level. In some way, that's not a bad thing. Some of the food labeling states have stricter laws that preempt the federal government's laws. It's not a matter of whether local or federal is better. It's a matter of the specific rule.
Well, but what's the difference between federal government regulating prescription drugs and supplements and vitamins? Why don't they have that same philosophy around food, which is also essentially medicine?
Well, hey, I agree with you. I mean, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and they seem to devote a lot more resources to the pharmaceutical side, though I would argue that food is the most important drug we take.
Right.
We take it every day, whether or not you need a prescription. I mean, the FDA does regulate a lot of foods. So does the USDA at federal level. They don't regulate restaurants and cleanliness. They regulate most of the actual product. So, wherever you buy a box of cereal, it doesn't matter what state, what supermarket, it's got to have that nutrition panel and list of ingredients that's mandated by the FDA. Health claims on products are mandated by the FDA. As a matter of fact, they just came out with new recommendations for what manufacturers can use the word healthy itself on food. And then the USDA is responsible for almost all of our meat and egg labeling, the grading. So when you go to buy a steak and it says, prime, choice, select, the
grade A,
meat, that's done by the USDA. And that's something that they actually do a really good job at. I think both agencies fail in a lot of respects, but they do certain things well. One example that's important is with any kind of food illness outbreak. We hear of particular fast food chain serving some meat that, makes everybody sick. They crack down on that very quickly. They know what slaughterhouse or where, or if it's lettuce, whatever the product is, where it came from, what lot. They're able to trace and contain those outbreaks very quickly. That's something the government devotes a lot of resources to as opposed to, say, inspecting our seafood.
So the USDA, the difference between that and the FDA is that the USDA is the one that promotes and that regulates the food producers, not necessarily the public, right? Not necessarily the consumer, right?
Well, really just the agricultural producers. Typically if it's an animal product, any kind of just meat, it's regulated by the USDA. If it's a processed food like a cereal or soup or something on the shelf, it's usually the FDA. So a lot more foods are under the auspices of the FDA. If you just think of the aisles of the supermarket, the stuff that comes from the farm, for the most part, is the USDA. And the biggest example there is the USDA is the one that's in charge of the organic labeling program for produce, for everything except seafood.
Is there a difference between natural and organic?
Legally, for sure. Like I said, natural means nothing. On a label, you should really just ignore it. Assume that, it's an attempt to deceive you. Really, literally meaningless. Organic has very defined legal meaning. There are people who find fault with the organic rules, and if you dive into them, there's some fertilizers and pesticides and practices allowed that people would say, well, that shouldn't be called organic. But I think compared to a lot of government regulation, overall, the organic rules are pretty good. When you buy something, especially produce or meat labeled organic, meat's a great example. I don't want antibiotics in my meat. It's that simple. That's something I personally try to avoid. If you buy meat labeled organic, it won't have antibiotics in it. That's sort of good enough for me. Problem is, most meat isn't organic.
What about free range? What does that mean?
That's pretty much meaningless.
Okay.
There is a definition of it when they raise these chickens in these huge overcrowded barns, and to call it free range or free roaming, they have to allow the chickens access to the outdoors. And what that means is that they put in the equivalent of like a dog door, a little door that the chickens could theoretically walk out. But the way that they're raised from birth and the way that they're trained and the way that they're raised, they don't do that. They never use that door. So it's like a theoretical. Free range means they could have gone outside, but they didn't actually do it. And there's a lot of terms. I mentioned natural, pasture raised, pasture finished, grass fed, no animal byproducts, free range, free roaming, green fed, humane, that are slapped on our food, all of which, are meaningless.
Interesting. All right. Well, speaking of labeling, what about GMOs? Do you have any updates on the labeling of genetically modified foods?
I really don't. It's something I decided not to cover in my book because, especially at the time I wrote the book, there were no rules.
Yeah, it's
so
changing.
There was no sort of fake my book is a lot about people violating the labeling laws, and when there's no labeling laws, there's nothing to violate.
Okay.
Vermont was the first state to pass some standards, but those have since been preempted by the federal government. It's still very young. It's up in the air how GMOs are going to shake out.
Well, based on your experience, because this is your industry, why do you think that was voted down? Do you think that was big business? Do you think, what do you really think?
Honestly, I've talked to a lot of scientists who really take the position that there's nothing wrong with GMOs, and they've kind of gotten a bad rap. And if I don't want to be put in a position of defending the industry. The way animals, plants have always been crossbred and hybridized, and when, you go to eat beef, it's not typically a cow that's been the way it was 1,000 years ago. It's been bred. The GMO is sort of a way of, in a lot of cases, of doing that same process in the laboratory. My concern is not so much the genetic modification of foods themselves, but the effect on the environment if it's out of control. Like they just approved the first genetically modified salmon, and they grow faster and bigger than regular salmon, and they're going to be farmed. If any of these escape in the wild, they're suddenly an invasive species that endangers the wild salmon. And in every case where they farm fish or other things, these animals have escaped, sort of like Jurassic Park, but in real life.
Right, of course. That's a huge issue if that can cross-contaminates wild-caught salmon, because then the entire industry is contaminated.
It is. Fortunately, the farm salmon right now, even the non-genetically modified farm salmon, is contaminating the wild salmon.
True. So stay away from salmon. What can we eat? My goodness. We haven't covered the Parmesan cheese part, and I do want to cover that. How do we know the ones that are cut with the wood pulp and the cheaper cheeses? How did you find that out? What's some of the evidence behind that?
Well, actually, so my thing is a little bit broader, right? I only want to eat Parmesan cheese that is from Italy, which, the reason Parmesan cheese is called Parmesan cheese is because Parmigiano Reggiano comes from Parma. It's a place in Italy. It's where this cheese was invented. It's where the best cheese is still made today. It's known in the industry as the king of cheese. And Parmigiano Reggiano is made under super strict laws, has been for 800 years, is very unadulterated product. It only has 3 ingredients in it: milk, salt, and rennet, and the milk has to come from cattle that were reared with no drugs and are not allowed to eat anything that was raised with pesticides or fertilizers. It's a super pure food. It's the cheese NASA chose to go into space with the astronauts because it's so pure and nutrient dense. Producers of Parmesan cheese were unable to get a trademark in the United States for the name Parmesan. So you're allowed in this country to make basically any cheese you want and label it Parmesan. My issue is not just the grated and the added cellulose, which got a lot of press this year. Inside Edition and Bloomberg, a number of media outlets did investigations of this cellulose, so-called wood pulp, being added to the cheese, but that really only affects the grated cheese. For me, I won't even buy a whole wedge of Parmesan cheese unless it's from Italy. But as far as the grated cheese, that's where the cellulose comes in. It's really supposed to be added to the cheese to keep it from clumping. It's an anti-caking agent. If you put a cardboard tube of grated cheese on the shelf and there's moisture and humidity in the air, it's going to solidify. So they add the cellulose to keep that from happening. The FDA, and this is a good example of the regulation, there's a lot of things that the FDA it's what they call recommendations, meaning that they have a policy but it's not binding. And so their recommendation is that manufacturers use only the amount of cellulose they need to achieve this anti-clumping purpose, which the industry typically is around 2%. But when Inside Edition tested those store brands of Parmesan grated cheese, some of them were over 20%. They had routinely 3, 4, 5, 10 times as much cellulose as you need, and the reality is because cellulose is cheaper than cheese. The more you put in, the more money you make. The solution is really easy. I would never buy grated Parmesan cheese. You only use grated cheese basically to put it on your pasta, put a little on your pizza, add some flavor. So if you just buy a wedge of cheese and take a grater and rub your hand over your food, it's going to take a couple of seconds and it's going to taste better.
Best way to do it. But I'm going back to the GMO issue, genetically modified organisms are much, much harder to get into Italy, aren't they?
The GMO rules are much tighter in Europe right now. It happens with organic as well, especially, things like honey, where it's dependent on insects or animals moving around. Is all of the seeds, the spores, things become airborne, they move around. As GMOs become more prevalent, there may well come a day when there is no such thing as non-GMO. And the same problem happens with organic food. You cannot keep everything out of your farm. You could put up a fence, but that doesn't stop the air.
That is an interesting statement. There may come a day where everything is genetically modified. That's a very good point. Yeah. Unless we grow it on our own, because of bees and birds and so forth, could still cross-contaminate if there's a genetically modified farm 5 miles from your house.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people who argue right now that there should be no such thing as organic honey. You cannot control what your bees go and what flowers they land on.
I don't know, with the flight of a bee, the travel distance of a bee. I have not done my research on how far a bee can travel, but it would be interesting to find out because the local area is usually the honey that you should eat. But there's imported honey from everywhere. Even if you can control your organic foods and where you shop and even growing your own foods, there's a possibility it can all be genetically modified, and at some point it might be. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about olive oils, champagne, and wines, the good stuff. And one of the chapters in his books, he quotes the Royal Society of Chemistry. And this is what it means to us listening. One of the greatest problems facing this branch of criminal investigation, food forensics is what he's calling it, is that consumers can't always tell when they're being defrauded. And this estimates the cost to the global food industry at $49 billion. Larry, what do you mean by that? Or what does the Royal Society of Chemistry mean by that?
So, they're in the UK. We also have an organization here in the U.S. at the Michigan State University called the Food Fraud Initiative. They did a similar study, and they came up with $50 billion versus $49 million. So that's probably a pretty accurate number because they were so close. And that's basically the cost to the consumers of what you're overpaying for food that is either adulterated or mislabeled. Would be, when you pay, as I mentioned earlier, say for red snapper and you get tilapia, you're way overpaying for the value. And adulterated would be when you buy, what you think is honey, but it's been cut with corn syrup, so you're getting a cheaper product.
What about the bottled water industry? Is there any regulation on that? And what's the difference between drinking water and purified water and table water?
That is not something I cover in the book. It is regulated. They have to meet the standards for safe drinking water. That they measure the quantity of lead and heavy metals and other things in the water. The issue gets a lot of press because a lot of the big producers basically are using tap water, which in most of the country is completely safe to drink. They're just filling because originally most bottled water came from streams or from a natural source. And some people prefer, like if you drink some of the French water, Evian, it comes from a spring in France, a particular place. You can go to the town of Evian, and that's where the water comes from. And, it's sort of known for that. A lot of the bottled water we drink today just comes from the tap. And so you're paying, $1 a bottle for something that's essentially free. Mm-hmm. That's the bigger problem, but it's not really a ripoff. You're paying for water, you're getting water. So to me, for my purposes in my book, Real Food, Fake Food, I define fake food as any time you get something other than what you think you're buying. And I think when you buy water, you expect to get water, and you get water.
So the point is, other than it being the fact that we're overpaying for food that is not what it says it is, but also that we need to have higher regulations. And how do you suggest that we do something like that, where we can actually get our government to comply with the whole fake food industry and make higher standards?
Well, I think it does need better regulation, but maybe even more importantly is it needs more enforcement of the existing regulations. So,
okay.
A lot of these things, I mentioned, the analogy of somebody selling counterfeit bags on the street. A lot of these things already are illegal or there's rules against it. It's just either not being enforced or there's not enough resources devoted to it. So, seafood fraud has widely been known. It's a long-term problem. It's a big problem. And in 2014, President Obama appointed a federal task force specifically to combat seafood fraud. And that gives you an idea how big the issue is. It's not like you hear about the president, convening a task force to fight milk fraud. So and their recommendations and practices are just starting to take effect now, and already, they're resulting in stepped-up FDA investigations of seafood, and hopefully there's going to be some other progress coming down the road. Likewise, in April of this year, Congress ordered the FDA to start inspecting imported olive oil. So, I think which was something that was always under the FDA's purview. So I think, if they do more of the things they're already supposed to do, it's going to help American consumers a lot. But in the meantime, it's not a hopeless situation. In all of these categories, there are real foods, delicious foods, safe foods that we can buy, and that's one of the things I do in the book. Is at the end of every chapter, the chapter on oil, the chapter on seafood, the chapter on cheese, I give very specific buying tips and information so people can navigate the landscape as it is right now.
Right, which is why you do books like this, which is why we do shows like this, is to give people more information about it. Can you tell me a little bit about the spices? We see pumpkin spice everything right now. Is the way that the food industry is, the way it goes, is pumpkin spice something that's developed by, say, one distributor or several distributors, and then people buy from that distributor, and then it gets put into the various coffees or whatever it is that it's put into? How does it work like that with spices like that?
Well, usually with flavorings, and I think because there's when you say spices, I think people think of like oregano or nutmeg, which are sort of naturally occurring spices, and that industry has its own issues. But with the flavorings issue, it's really sort of a laboratory business. They make these chemical flavors, and then they can add them to all kinds of foods. And it's not made by one company. There's lots of companies that make flavorings, but they do provide them to the food service industry. And so just today, I saw at the supermarket, I'd never seen this before. You know, you mentioned pumpkins. It's that fall holiday time. I saw turkey and gravy flavored potato chips.
Right, I've seen those too. Mm-hmm.
Which I had never seen before. I thought that's kind of novel. But I know, like with Doritos, for example, which, you know, it's the same chip, but it comes in all these different flavors, Cool Ranch, you know, different flavors. You know, it goes down a line, and the chips are sprayed with a liquefied version of the flavor. Mm-hmm. And that's, you know, how a lot of those flavor products work. And I'm very, very wary of the word flavor. That's sort of the code in FDA labeling for not real. So if something is like pumpkin flavored, that's different from it actually containing pumpkin. I talk in my book as a good example about truffle oil. Like, truffle oil almost never contains any actual truffle. It contains what's called natural truffle flavor, which, and you know, natural flavor is a big loophole. That means that the flavor was created through what's considered a natural process. Doesn't mean it was made from a natural ingredient. It's very confusing to consumers, but basically a lot of the flavor products are distilled. It's the same way you make perfume, and that is considered a natural process because you're basically boiling something and capturing the essence of it, but that doesn't mean that the ingredients you're using are natural. And when you take I went to a flavor lab in London, you know, a business that specialized in creating flavors for the food industry. And to them, and you know, the scientists basically told me, you know, if you take any solid substance and you heat it sufficiently, it turns to liquid. Once it turns to liquid, you capture the steam, it recondenses into a clear liquid that is essentially that product in a clear liquid form. And to demonstrate this, he took a beaker and a handful of potting soil, just dirt, put it in this beaker, put it on this super hot burner, heated it until the dirt literally boiled, if you can imagine how hot that would be.
Wow.
Recaptured the steam and handed me a shot glass of this clear liquid that looks like water and said, taste this. And it was essentially liquid dirt. I tasted it. I could not get the taste out of my mouth for like 2 days. But wow. You can do that with anything from, you know, pumpkins to chemicals to grass to dirt. And once you do that, you can add that to any food. You could spray it on. You can add it in. It's not like, you know, they're stirring in, you know, fresh pumpkin in a lot of cases. Sometimes
right.
They are.
Well, that's what the whole process of natural means. All right. Well, we are going to take your calls after we take a quick break here, and we come back with Larry Olmsted, and we will take your calls about real food and fake food. This is Lisa Garrer. You're listening to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. And Larry Olmsted is my guest from the book Real Food, Fake Food. Let's go to our callers here. We've got a first-time caller, Bob in Seattle. Hi, Bob. Do you have a question for Larry Olmsted?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Larry, I know this isn't actually your slot or
expertise,
whatever you want to call it, but are you or is anybody else tracking the effects of the Fukushima outflow on the Pacific fisheries?
You know, I've seen plenty of literature about it. People are studying it. I haven't seen anything, to be honest, that would prevent me from eating the fish, but I know on you know, the West Coast it's been more of a matter of concern, and you know, I know it seems like it's been a long time already, but I think the jury's still out.
Okay, thank you.
Well, good question though, and we have appreciate your call. We have reported on it on this show in the past and just found levels of. There have been studies where levels of radiation poisoning have been found in the foods, but I don't specifically remember. We have done many shows on it, though, here on Coast to Coast. Let's talk to Robert in Chicago. Hi, Robert. Do you have a question for...
Lisa.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Larry. Larry, listen, I'm concerned. I used to be a big fish eater, but not anymore. Because of the worms that have been found in fish, how do these companies keep the worms out or get the worms out of these out of the fish? Like a large company, a big company like McDonald's, they sell that fish sandwich. I'm always concerned about a worm in the fish.
Good point. And beef, too. Beef has worms as well. Maggots.
Well, I mean, with the worms, a lot of it is cut out in the processing. When they cut fish into individual steaks or fillets, somebody is physically doing that and looking at it's not like most people are buying a whole fish. So when they carve it into fillets, if they see the worms, they throw out that part. McDonald's in particular, it's interesting that you bring that up because, this hasn't gotten a lot of publicity, ironically, because, McDonald's and like Walmart and some other places are under the perception that if they sort of, boast about more sustainable or better ingredients, their customers perceive it as more expensive and don't want to buy it. But a few years ago, McDonald's switched the production or the supply of all of their McFish sandwiches to wild Alaskan pollock. They used to use cod. And the Alaskan pollock fishery is rated one of the most sustainable in the entire world, and it has the certification of the Marine Stewardship Council. You mentioned earlier these third-party seals we can look for at the food. The Marine Stewardship Council seal is considered the best, the gold standard for the seafood industry for third-party auditing and oversight, and that's on the McDonald's McFish sandwich, and very few people know that. So it's actually one of the kind of fast foods I feel comfortable eating.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow, great to know. Thank you so much for your call. I remember doing an interview years ago about a guy who took beef, basically, and put it in the freezer and duct taped the freezer, came back, I think a week or so later, opened it up and found maggots in the beef that laid eggs and had more maggots. And I've seen this several times. You can look it up online. I can't remember the specific guest, but that there are maggots formed in the meat. Is that in the meat before, or is it just frozen and it holds the process of the maggots developing?
No, that's something that comes into the rotting meat, and not just rotting meat, other foods. The maggots, they're, from microscopic, they grow when the food rots. They're not in the food to begin with. They're sort of, for lack of a better word, attracted to the rotting food. So, I have, there certainly are issues of worms in, basically all animals. I mean, people can get worms, dogs get worms, but it's not something that is widespread, especially in the beef industry.
Where are they? Where are they hanging out? They do attract everything. Cat food, dog food. All right, let's go to Spencer in Atlanta. Spencer, do you have a question for Larry Olmsted?
Lisa, I like to say first that George knows how to pick his guest host. You have an interviewing style that's so unique and so lovely.
Oh, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. You deserve it. And Mr. Olmsted, I ask you about what my question is. We have two parks down here in Atlanta that was designed by Olmsted. Are you some kin to them?
I am, yeah. That would be Frederick Law Olmsted, who also designed Central Park, most famously in New York, and did a lot of work around the country.
Oh,
well, that answered my first question. But now I don't even like salmon.
Yeah, a lot of people don't.
But my fish is whiting and perch fillet.
Okay.
Yeah, well, so in general, with seafood, the more expensive the fish, the more fraud there is. So whiting and perch are not as expensive as salmon and red snapper and grouper. So they're generally safer fish to buy. And whiting in particular, if you're buying it, I don't know if you're buying it whole, but it's a more. I always recommend if people know how to prepare fish, they're better off buying it whole because it's more recognizable.
Wow. So that makes sense. If you have access to the whole fish, you can, You definitely know where it came from and what it looks like. Thank you so much for your call. Appreciate it, Spencer. Have a good night. Let's go to Dean in Tampa, Florida. How's it going there, Dean?
It's going good. I'm just I'm happy that I'm the West Coast instead of the East Coast after Hurricane Matthew.
Wow.
And my thoughts and prayers are all to those people. But
I was just going to say the same thing. Absolutely. Yeah. If they can hear us, maybe they'll hear us the next day, because a lot of people don't have power right now. So my thoughts and prayers are with them as well.
Yeah, it's you don't know how you realize what you lose until you lose it, like power, and then everyone's flocking over to the East Coast because they're looking to our hotel rooms completely filled up.
I'm sure.
And I can only imagine what it's like.
You can come to the West Coast. There's not a drop of rain here.
Well, that's
sadly.
One thing about, yeah, that's the one thing. But speaking of fish, ironically, we went through this whole fake grouper thing here in Tampa with restaurants, and having lived in Alaska, Texas, and Florida for many years and seen, and by the way, I'm not a fan of salmon either. Halibut is much better, but it's really, there's a lot of cases where, we're putting out products that, even like the tilapia, there was a report that said that, the fish farms, you're not getting the protein, you're not getting the, the nutrients that you would normally get from fish, because we're literally growing them like a factory. And I think that's sad.
That would make sense. The farmed fish don't have the level of nutrients, of course. They're hybridized and chemicalized, and that makes a lot of sense. They would actually have, because of the chemicals, have lower immunity anyway, so they couldn't produce the full amount of, I guess, nutrients in the actual farmed fish. That's a great point.
We're basically getting fake fish.
Mm-hmm.
Which
the
is
farmed
bad,
fish.
Because having experienced, just fishing in the Keys and fishing in Alaska and parts of Texas, and seeing how, something like that is actually something good for us. But yet, guess what, guys? The chemicals, and you can go to your grocery stores and, and buy your tilapias, which I think tilapia, we've basically farmed that out to the point where there's, there's nothing.
You are correct.
Good for us.
Absolutely.
Fish is supposed to be good for us.
It's supposed to be, yeah. It's on the heart healthy diet. Well, thank you so much for your phone call. And Larry, maybe when we come back, we can talk a little bit about fish oils, if you know anything about those, and if those are still good for us based on what we know about farm fish and where those fish oils would be coming from. All right, so we will take a quick break here. We will be back with Larry Olmsted and your phone calls. Thank you so much for calling in. And this is Lisa Garrer. You're listening to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. This is Lisa Garrer, and my guest is Larry Olmsted, the author of Real Food, Fake Food, as well as a health journalist, award-winning food journalist and travel writer. Now, we have a caller on the line, Carrie, who's calling in from Alaska. Apparently, he is an Alaskan fisherman. Hi, Carrie. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you doing, Lisa?
Great. Thanks for your phone call. What is your question, Carrie?
Well, I'm a commercial fisherman and been in the salmon industry for over 20 years, in Alaska about 25 years.
Wow.
And I think Larry would be an awesome guy to advertise our fish, because he's been saying a lot of great things. I don't know if you realize this, but we have outlawed all farm fishing in Alaska.
Really?
So, yeah, and we have done a great job, or I should say the regulators have done a great job of keeping the fishery sustainable. And it really helps out. But we've actually caught Atlantic farm fish in Alaska. So what he mentioned earlier about the contamination is a big concern for us.
So you've already found, would you say that those are genetically modified farmed fish?
Well, basically farm fish. They're raised in their own coop, and they get all kinds of diseases. And the biggest concern is when they, have a fence that breaks and they escape. We're worried that the diseases that they carry could transfer over to the wild salmon. That's the biggest concern we have.
How can you tell the difference? What do they look like?
Well, Atlantic salmon do look a lot different, and so the Fish and Game has given us, for just any normal person it'd be a little tough, but we're used to catching all the different species. We have sockeyes and kings and chums and different species, so they do look different, and there's certain, fin characteristics that we have to look at. And that's how we can tell the difference. But it is a big concern. One other thing I wanted to bring up real quick, if you don't mind, I was born and raised in Japan, and as a missionary kid, so I speak fluent Japanese. So he was mentioning sushi, and I eat sushi a lot here in the U.S. But what a lot of people don't realize is probably 90-some% of all sushi restaurants are not Japanese. Did you know that?
Right, and the sushi in Japan is so different than the sushi here.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
You cannot, it's not even this recognizable.
Right. And so keeping the legitimate salmon in that sushi is really difficult for the consumer to ever know whether it's really Alaska salmon or farm salmon or even like he was talking about tilapia and things like that.
How would you tell the difference?
I really appreciate the service that Larry's offering. Thanks, Larry. You're a great source of information for everybody.
Thank you so much for your. Let me ask you real quick, Carrie. If you were to just give us a few pointers, how could we tell the difference between farmed salmon and fresh Atlantic salmon?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest with you. Even though I've been in the industry, both as a fisherman and a buyer and a tenderman and a processor for years and years and years, it's hard for me to tell the difference.
Wow.
Yeah.
Alaskan salmon, sorry.
But the difference actually exists more in the, we're worried about the chemicals, the way they're brought up, and the safety aspect. So just the flavor, I can tell most of the time, but it's difficult just by looking. It's more in the quality of the fish. And like a sushi chef, they know the difference because they're buying it. So it's the integrity of the store that you really almost have to rely on.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for your insight. I appreciate it. Larry, do you have any comments about that? Anything to contribute?
I mean, Terry brought up a great point, which is that aquaculture is illegal in Alaska. So it's not just the salmon, it's any seafood you buy from Alaska. They're famous for their crabs, but there's also a lot of pollock, halibut. These are all wild-caught fish, and which to me is a good thing. In Alaska, they have a logo for their seafood. It says Alaska Fresh Wild, and they spend a lot of money protecting that logo. If people rip it off, they'll sue them. So I look at that as something really good. If you see a can of salmon and it has that Alaska logo, that's a good sign. Also, the sushi issue, sushi began as sort of a celebratory fine dining kind of thing. You would go to a sushi restaurant for a nice meal, and there would be a chef behind the counter, and he would take a big piece of salmon or tuna or whatever the fish was and cut it in front of you to order to make your dinner. And now we've kind of dumbed down sushi to the point where people think it's something you pick up in a plastic box at the supermarket. Most of the people who eat sushi in this country are never seeing it made, and I think that's a big part of the problem.
Right. We don't even sit at the bar any longer, the sushi bar. We sit at the table. All right, we need to take another quick break, and I think the answer here is to be vegan. That would probably help. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the important stuff like champagne, whiskey, and coffee. We will be right back. This is Lisa Garrer. You're listening to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. So Larry Olmsted is my guest, and we're talking about real food versus fake food. Now, here I am sitting here with some Halloween candy because it is the season. And on my candy bar here, it says, here's the milk chocolate. And the ingredients are sugar, chocolate, cocoa butter, skim milk, lactose, and milk fat. So where's the chocolate tree? I want to know that. Can I just...
chocolate, like coffee, grows in warm weather climates.
But why doesn't it say cacao instead of... I mean, there is no such thing as chocolate trees.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So funny that they would put chocolate as the ingredients.
Yeah, usually it would say, cocoa.
It would. But it says milk chocolate ingredients, sugar, chocolate. And this is like your Hershey's and your M&Ms. I mean, but maybe I'm missing something. But I'm just wondering if you're looking at something about like champagne. Here's a perfect example. If you can explain a little bit about the Champagne region and the process that champagne is made is specific to the region of Champagne, France, right?
Well, it should be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Champagne obviously is named for the Champagne region where it was invented. It's the world's most famous wine, and what obviously sets it apart is the fact that it's sparkling and it has the bubbles, and the way that that is produced is by adding a little bit of yeast and a little bit of sugar, and as the sugar eats the yeast, it converts it to gas, which is what the bubbles are. And by law, that has to be done in the individual bottles. So if you visit the Champagne region, there's these cellars, and there's thousands and thousands, millions of bottles in racks going through this process, and each bottle is sort of its own little science experiment. It's like a little winery in each bottle, and it's a very expensive way to produce wine because then each bottle has to be opened and recorked and turned and but the result tastes really good, and they also there's a lot of quality control standards. They use excellent grapes. There's a reason why Champagne is famously good. But you can also make sparkling wine in a lot of other ways. You can do the same process in big tanks, or you can skip the fermentation part altogether and just take still wine and inject gas into it like Coca-Cola is made, just carbonate wine basically. And any of those methods are legal to produce bottles in the United States that can be labeled champagne, and that surprises a lot of consumers when they survey consumers. People almost always infallibly believe that the word champagne means it has to come from Champagne, and in most of the world that's true, but not in the United States. And it's similar to we talked about earlier, Kobe beef. It's these are and Parmesan cheese. These are foods that are known as geographically indicated foods. They're associated with a place, and for the most part in the U.S., those foods are not protected by law. So you can, take these famous names that have a high designation of quality and make them very inexpensively and sell them, and consumers are confused.
Does that same thing go for Scotch and whiskey?
No, so Scotch I use in my book as an example of sort of how the right way to regulate this industry is. And, for reasons that are really unclear, Congress, literally, we say, we need an act of Congress. There's an act of Congress in the Federal Register to protect Scotch specifically that says, Scotch whiskey can only be a product of Scotland made under the laws of the English government, the British government, and it's really one of the only foods that gets that. So we don't have that for Champagne or Kobe beef or Parmesan cheese. So when you buy Scotch whiskey, you know exactly what you're getting in terms of the quality and origin, and to me, that's the way all of our food should be.
Fascinating. Do you think that, that was obviously grandfathered in from other countries from a very long time ago. Do you think that the FDA is part of some type of a maybe big conspiracy to decimate the food industry and basically make us all sick? I remember, getting on from a flight. We were in Italy. We came back to the U.S., and I got onto one of the airport buses, and all I saw was edema and hair falling out. And I really looked at the American people, and sometimes it looks like it's a conspiracy. It really does. What is your thought about that?
No, I don't. I can't really, buy into that. I think, certainly, we have one of the best healthcare systems in the world. We pioneer all kinds of cutting edge medicine here, a lot of which is also, under the auspices of the FDA. And in certain areas of food, we talked a lot tonight about aquaculture. The U.S. has by far the best both aquaculture and wild fishery management in the world. The problem is we don't do a lot of aquaculture in this country because it's too expensive to do it the way that we mandate because of the quality. So most is imported. But I think if there was a food conspiracy against the American people, then we would have much more lax laws when it comes to things like grading beef and producing fish. So no, I think it's more just a lot of poorly used resources.
Well, all right. So there are a lot of solutions here, and there are great. In terms of a website, can you suggest a website that does recommend some of the more trusted brands that you recommend in the book? Do you put them all in one place anywhere?
The website for my book is the same title. The book is Real Food, Fake Food. The website is realfoodfakefood.com, and I have links to a lot of articles from, very legitimate news sources like 60 Minutes and different exposés on the various foods. But it's really. It really varies by the type of food. So there's a great resource website for olive oil that's very up to date that I give in the book, and it's also on my website. But there's no one sort of clearinghouse for all the different foods. It depends on the category.
Okay, I want to take one more call here. We've got Brenda calling in from Morgantown, West Virginia. Brenda, hi. Do you have a question or a comment for Larry Olmsted?
Hi, Larry. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Yeah, you guys are on a topic that has been a big part of my life. Well, I'm 58 years old now, and when I was 24, I'd bought my first piece of property and designed and built my first house. Well,
wow.
For 25 years, I've been drinking distilled water because I have stomach problems. But also, almost all my life, you guys, I've been eating organic food that I grew myself out of my own garden.
Aha.
And I just think that people still don't understand, that they need to get back to basics. And you can read and study and everything you want, but it's still, you got to grow your own stuff in your own dirt if you don't want to care what you eat,
If you want to control it.
Yeah,
can I ask you a
the
question?
Free-range chickens, I live in an area where people have chickens and everything. Free-range chickens, the eggs, taste so different, it's unreal, if they really are free range and they do actually get out in the yards and in the fields and eat, the bugs and everything they're supposed to eat, And the HMO stuff, oh my God, it's getting to the point where without the right seeds, I can't even grow a garden anymore. And everybody I know that's vegan is a lot healthier than me. And I've been trying, 80% of my life has been vegan. And I've probably been dead now if it wasn't for the way I ate because of all the family medical history I inherited. But anyway, my life has been a big experiment on all this. And I would just like to say, I just wish people would really get, in reality, their brain in reality here and start understanding that growing their own stuff is the only way they're going to know.
Do you grow anything hydroponically?
I had a friend, let me say one more thing. I had this friend come from New York City to my farm, and he stayed a few months. I could not keep this man out of my garden. He ate food out of my garden, though, Lisa. He said, oh, my God, I can't believe what this tastes like. And I said, yeah, that's right, Rob. This is real food. You've been eating in New York City all your life. I said, hey, after that was it. I couldn't keep that man out of the garden. He couldn't believe the difference.
Did he move back? Yeah, I know. It's once you eat like that. We've gotten so far away from the garden and so into our markets and restaurants. It is a different way of life, and we have to keep doing shows like this and reading books like this and having people like you on to remind us we need to eat back from the ground and from the earth. Thank you so much for your call, Brenda. I appreciate it. Yeah, I definitely do see a rise in autoimmune disease, and if we have as many toxins as we do in our air and our soil and our water, that's obviously going into our food. So we need to do other things in order to combat this, especially with this huge rise in autoimmune diseases these days. And it's just not slowing down. Do you have any comment on that in terms of the relationship between what you talk about with fake food and disease?
Well, I mean, the CDC documents something like 40-something million cases of food-related illness a year in the United States, and the vast majority, something like 80% of those, they don't know the cause of. So there's definitely, I think, and there's a big correlation between what we eat and our health. And I approach this book, coming, as a food writer, predominantly. So my interest is in a lot of ways based on taste. I want to eat things that taste delicious. And our gut reaction, I think, is that things that taste good aren't always so good for you because people like things like chocolate bars. But the reality I found is that, when you eat these real foods like real extra virgin olive oil that's, fresh squeezed from olives and real wild-caught fish, and they're almost always healthier and they almost always taste better. It's sort of a win-win. Once you start eating real food, that tomato from your garden is always going to taste better than the one from the supermarket.
Absolutely, and so is the real olive oil and so forth. Well, thank you so much for the information, Larry. I appreciate you staying up for this conversation tonight. It's been fascinating, and listeners loved it, and I appreciate you being on.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, and we will be back. We're going to be talking with U.S. Navy Commanding Officer and the aide to the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Suzanne Giesman. She's going to be joining us next to talk about her book called Messages of Hope. This is Lisa Garrer, and you're listening to Coast AM.